Hi, good morning. Today, in this segment, I'm going to talk about slavery and racism. Many people think both of them are history. No, today we live with them. There are a lot of slaves around the world, and racism is persistent in our society. Discrimination is our way of life. Many people believe that racism and prejudice are things of the past in this country and in the world, that civil rights legislation and greater enlightenment have conquered discrimination. It is true that things have changed in the past 20 or 25 years, but it is also true that racism is still rampant both in this country and around the world. Many of us live with an illusion that all the problems have been solved and that we enjoy racial harmony in this land. But the minority press does carry full coverage of racial injustices, and minority people are deeply aware of the crippling extent of racism in their own lives and elsewhere. It is clear that racism and racial prejudice exist everywhere. No country is spared. It ranges from the black racism of Uganda to the white racism of South Africa and Rhodesia. Racism exists in the Brahmins of Tamil Nadu to the Yadavas of Bihar. Racism festers between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland, between Muslims and Christians in Lebanon, between Arab and Israeli peoples in the Middle East, between French and English speaking Canadians, between the Flemish and the Walloons of Belgium, between Catholic priests and their bishops. How did we get that way? Why do we who think of ourselves as good, kind, decent human beings allow racism to continue among us when it not only destroys the victims but also, if we could only see it, destroys us? The problems of racism have not been solved, and they will never be solved until we can learn to communicate with one another. As in the past, if a minority person tells us truths about ourselves that offend our prejudices, we promptly brand that person arrogant or uppity and try to get rid of him. I believe that only through deeper awareness and understanding can we hope to cure the wounds that racism causes in ourselves as well as in those whom we hurt through our prejudices. When we were still young, perhaps 6 or 7, society, in the kind and gentle voices of our parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, did a terrible thing to us. We learned to label the minority people as the other. We saw them as other and different and not like us. And always that implied that they were somehow inferior to us. Similar patterns hold true everywhere. In Nazi Germany, the non-Jewish child was brought up to view Jewish people as the other. In Ireland, today the Protestant child is taught to believe that the Catholic child is other. And the Catholic child is taught to see the Protestant child as other. In India, Higher caste child is taught to believe that the Dalit child as other. We find the same pattern when we hear people refer to the French as immortal, or to Mexicans as lazy, or to any group as possessing racial characteristics of a degrading nature. And once we believe that a group of people is different, then we can believe that they do not need or deserve the same rights and liberties we always claim for ourselves. Many of us go through life without ever realizing how deeply tainted we are by these prejudices. The patterns of racism are identical regardless of where or when they occur, and regardless of who victimizes whom. Racism always involves an injustice committed by one person or group against another person or group for reasons of race, color, religion, or political ideology. It is fatal in the end because it always works to damage both groups. The more racism succeeds, the more it damages both the racist and his victims. We know quite a lot about racism. We know, for example, that prejudice exists at the irrational level, placed in us as early learned behavior patterns. It is so deeply formed in us that many tend to view prejudice simply as part of human nature, which it is not at all. We also know that we could no longer blame racial injustice on the trash as we had always done in the past. We know that the world was full of people who are beautifully educated and who can handle reason superbly in every aspect of their existence except for a deeply held prejudice. When you approach people in this area of prejudice, their response tends to be immediate, emotional, and irrational. They seem impervious to scientific data. No, it isn't just the trash. We have people of great distinction who are racist, religious in administration, who hold public office, political leaders, professional leaders, judges, and educators. Unfortunately, we sense these evil forces all around us and expect to live on as if nothing matters. Even more than that, we are well aware of the ugly prejudices people have against these other people. People call them ugly names, kept them out of many places because of their race, ridiculed them because of their vulnerability, told them they could not make it in school or in society because they were not smart enough, and kept them out of seminaries and convents because they were not ethnically pure or holy enough to be there. Their own were never present in positions of leadership in their church, schools, or society, as if God Himself did not trust us. Ironically, Jesus called 12 disciples who were of one race and the race of Jesus, and all of them were Jews. We know without any doubt that our own formation, no matter how benevolent, had filled us with prejudices at deep levels that had probably handicapped us for life. We might never see fellow human beings in their true light simply as people. Our prejudices have, in a way, shaped our life around neighbors, and most of the times we come out with the verdict guilty in our interactions between them. And since we cannot admitting guilt We cannot admit our prejudices even to ourselves. Perhaps we must rethink this. There is not necessarily any guilt attached to having the prejudices, since most of us are no more guilty of acquiring our prejudices than we are guilty of acquiring a disfiguring pockmark from some childhood illness. We got both when we were very young and before we could do anything to avoid them. But prejudice becomes a source of unspeakable guilt when we allow it to cloud our intelligence and to goad us into cooperating with unjust actions against other human beings. All men face the same fundamental human problems of loving, of suffering, of fulfilling human aspirations, and of dying. These are common denominators in all people of all cultures and all races and all ethnic categories. One of the truly tragic byproducts of racism is that it leads some people to make it more difficult for others to resolve these problems, and for no reason that makes any sense. Today, minority people can eat and sleep almost anywhere and can use unsegregated places in the church or in the cemeteries. But deeper problems of discrimination in employment, housing, schooling, banking, business, health services, churches, and courts remain massive and crippling. Such discrimination makes itself felt in thousands of subtle ways that the laws have not touched and probably cannot ever touch. So, minority people continue to bear the burdens of injustice which spring from a racism that goes largely uncorrected in most contemporary societies. But despite massive efforts to make this country live up to its promise of equal justice and equal opportunities for all, prejudice and discrimination continue to plague minority people as it does to this day. The prejudiced simply found ways to get around the civil right laws. The society expected the minority were to be docile servants of the dominant society. We in our hearts knew this was not right, and since many of the people who treated us as if we were inferior and unworthy apparently were good people, we could only attribute their ugliness towards us not as malice but as a result of a much deeper evil. In time, we would come to recognize this deeper evil as structural sin, as structural violence, which leads good people to do bad and horrible things while being convinced they are doing a right thing. It is this structural evil that distorts, confuses, sometimes even perverts our image and appreciation of others, of God, and worst of all, ourselves. It is this structural evil that blinds people from seeing the truth. Wasn't this exactly what happened to the good and holy people who condemned Jesus as diabolically possessed, as a blasphemer and a common criminal, while they were convinced they were speaking for God? Wasn't this the very sin of the world that Jesus came to demolish? The very structures of society, in a special way, the very hierarchy in an organized religion, which we are all familiar with, and that could not appreciate him and ultimately killed him. As a result, this kind of cheating, our country has gone from good solutions to poor solutions in many instances. Alienation and separation are the decrees towards minority. The first principle of racism is that you blame the victim. In Nazi Germany, Jewish people were blamed for everything that was wrong with the country, even their own Holocaust. The same holds true everywhere. What suppressed minorities the world over have learned is that the racism directed against them has little or nothing to do with what they do or fail to do. The discrimination against them does not depend on them, but on the political and economic climate as a whole. Today, the deepest frustration of minorities comes from this fact. They are being blamed for conditions which they in no way caused. This takes its terrible toll on all of us, on the very climate of human civilization. Why do people still cling to the prejudices that poison them as well as their victims? We ask this question again and again. What sense does it make to go on perpetrating a system that prevents fellow human beings from becoming fully functioning and fully contributing members of the society? Some people say it is human nature. These prejudices spring from those early learned behavior patterns in which the children of one culture learn to view the children of other cultures as different. This dehumanizes them by destroying their respect for the lives of those who appear to differ from them. Until we see this and learn to break the vicious cycle that it perpetuates, we have little hope for durable solutions. Understanding the cause of the problem is half the battle. Serious people now understand that the problems of racism need the best minds and the best attitudes of all people, the oppressor and the oppressed. Thank God, these people are cautiously opening up communications. Once more, the question keeps pounding within my head and in my heart. Who, humanly speaking, was Jesus of Nazareth, and why did God become this very particular, stereotypically marked human being in order to be the Savior of the world? What is the saving element of his earthly identity? After all, God is conquering and colonizing empires of this world, but through the marginal poor of the colonized peoples of the world. Yet, he did not convert the colonized into colonizers, but allowed them to initiate something new that would go beyond the categories of the colonizer and the colonized. Jean Lacroix, the great French philosopher of communications, has said that before we can authentically communicate with one another, we must first open ourselves to the other. I believe that we can truly dialogue with one another, we must perceive intellectually and then at the profoundest emotional level that there is no other. That the other is simply oneself in all the important essentials. In India, an actor turned politician, M.G. Ramachandran, would sing in the silver screen, "There are only two races, man and woman." Thank you.